All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are tackling one of the most explosive figures in all of American history, John Brown. We're going to be using the amazing work of historian David S. Reynolds to really unpack the man, his mission, and his incredibly controversial legacy. So here's the big question, right? Was this guy a righteous martyr, a saint who died to end the absolute sin of slavery? Or was he a violent terrorist who basically forced a nation into war? The thing is, for more than 150 years, we just haven't been able to agree. Even people back then, like the famous writer Henry David Thoreau, they got that Brown wasn't simple. Thoreau said, and I love this quote, that Brown's peers didn't exist, so he couldn't be judged by them. I mean, think about that. He's basically saying this guy was operating on a totally different moral planet. So if we really want to understand him, we can't start with his guns. No, we have to start with his God. Right. So to really get John Brown, you gotta understand that his actions didn't come out of nowhere. They were fueled by this incredibly intense holy war he believed he was fighting, a war that started with his religious roots. Okay, so what was this belief? Well, at its core, it was a movement called New Divinity Calvinism. Now, this wasn't your, go to church on Sunday kind of faith. This was an all-encompassing worldview. It taught that slavery wasn't just a social problem or a political issue. It was a deep, profound sin against God himself. And a sin like that, it doesn't just call for prayers or pamphlets. It demands action. For John Brown, this meant fighting slavery was literally his holy mission. And look, this wasn't something he just picked up later in life. It was baked into his DNA from the very beginning. I mean, his dad was a hardcore abolitionist before John was even born. And then, that moment at age 12. Can you imagine seeing another kid, your age, beaten so brutally with a shovel? That seared something into his soul. He said later that that was the moment he privately swore eternal war against slavery. Just, wow. So with that kind of fire in his belly, it's no surprise that Brown just didn't fit in with the typical abolitionists of his day. Not at all. They wanted the same thing, sure, but how they planned to get there, completely different worlds. So you've basically got two competing paths here. In one corner, you have the Garrisonians, the main abolitionist group. They were total pacifists. Their big idea was, let's just let the South go. We don't want them. They even burned the Constitution in public, calling it a covenant with death. And then you have John Brown. He was the total opposite. He believed in righteous violence. He was fiercely pro-union, and he looked at the Constitution and thought, we don't burn this, we fix this. And this is the key thing to get about him. He wasn't some anarchist who hated America. He saw himself as the ultimate patriot. He loved the flag, he loved the Union, and he idolized that line from the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. He just believed the country had lost its way, and he was going to be the one to force it back on track, even writing his own anti-slavery constitution to prove it could work. So, what was the real impact of all this? What did he actually do? Well, historian David S. Reynolds gives us this really brilliant way to think about it. It's all about a series of powerful distinctions. Okay, first up, Reynolds says he did not end slavery, but he killed it. What does that mean? It means he made a peaceful compromise totally impossible. After his raid, there was no more middle ground. The lines were drawn in the sand, and he forced a violent showdown. Next, he did not cause the Civil War, but he sparked it. You see, the country was already a giant powder keg, just waiting. His raid on Harper's Ferry, that was the match that lit the fuse. And finally, he did not bring about civil rights, but he seeded it. By his actions, he planted a powerful, enduring idea that the fight for racial equality was a cause so just, so righteous, that it was worth dying for. He set a new bar for moral conviction. Now, you might think the story ends with his execution, but not even close. John Brown's ghost, you could say, would go on to haunt the entire nation, and especially one man in particular, Abraham Lincoln. It's fascinating, really. Brown's legacy has been this kind of cultural battlefield. During the Civil War, he was a hero. Union soldiers literally marched to war singing a song about him. But then, during the Jim Crow era, he was recast as a crazed villain to justify segregation. Then, the Harlem Renaissance comes along, and he's reclaimed as this righteous hero. To this day, his image is used and argued over by all sorts of groups. And this brings us back to Lincoln. Early on as a politician, he had to keep his distance, right? He publicly condemned Brown's methods. But the war changed him. Seeing the sacrifice of 180,000 black soldiers fighting for the Union, it transformed his thinking. And get this, by 1864, Lincoln secretly asked Frederick Douglass to organize what was basically a John Brown-style raid to spread emancipation and stir up rebellion. He had come all the way around to Brown's way of thinking. And then comes the final, tragic connection. April 1865. Lincoln gives a speech. And for the very first time in American history, a president publicly suggests that some black men should have the right to vote. In the crowd that night was John Wilkes Booth. And when he heard Lincoln say those words, he turned to a friend and made his decision. So, in the end, John Wilkes Booth lost. And in a strange, tragic way, John Brown had won. Booth's act of violence didn't stop progress. It martyred Lincoln, forever tying him to the very cause of equality that John Brown had given his own life for years before. And that's what makes John Brown's story so powerful, and frankly, so unsettling. It leaves us with a really tough question. Slavery was the law of the land, totally protected. So, when you face an injustice that is legal, but you know is deeply wrong, what does it take to confront it? What's the takeaway here? It's that the line between a hero and a fanatic, well, that line is often drawn by who gets to write the history books.